Welcome back to the Book on Fire podcast. This episode is the continuation of our conversation about Chapter 4 of The Dawn of Everything, Chapter 4, Free Peoples and the Origin of Property. But before I play you the rest of that conversation, I want to give one more plug and some credit due to the What is Politics podcast. What is Politics? You might remember this one from previous mentions on the show, particularly in episode 3. I've been in communication with Daniel, who's the host of that podcast, since the last episode of The Book on Fire was published. And I've learned that what I've been presenting as kind of like, this is what the rest of anthropology, who are not Graeber and Wengrow, think about the importance of material conditions in the Paleolithic and human history, that those ideas are maybe not so much the anthropological consensus as a pretty powerful and unique distillation and organization of materialist currents in anthropology that Daniel, the host of What is Politics, has put together for his show. And as such, I really owe him a lot of thanks for handing me this lens of the materialist view in anthropology that I've been trying to bring into our show at various times and bring into conversation with what's happening in the Dawn of Everything. His podcast is all about trying to teach his listeners, and there's a YouTube version as well, so his listeners and his viewers, how to coherently think politics. And he has a anthropology background, so he's always bringing that in. And I think it's really effective. I would have had much less to work with when reading through The Dawn of Everything on this second time if it hadn't been what I learned over there from listening to What is Politics. So if you're interested in going deeper with the materialism that we've been bringing in our discussions about The Dawn of Everything, you should definitely check out Daniel's show. And if you listen to his multi-part, chapter-by-chapter critique of The Dawn of Everything, which he's still in the process of putting out, then you will certainly notice the similarity in some of the ways of thinking, the kinds of questions that get asked, and some of the observations that in particular I have made on The Book on Fire. And it's because I got to thinking about those things first from listening to that show. So thank you to Daniel for all of that, and do check out What is Politics. I'll put a link in the show notes again this time. All right, and with that, let's go on to the rest of our conversation about Chapter 4.
Their second objection to Solon's piece has to do with his choice to take what were contemporary forager societies in Africa and project their lifeways onto the past.
Yeah, like could they actually be a model for what our prehistoric ancestors' lives were like?
And especially since there was already some knowledge of other forager lifeways at that point, which Solon's even maybe mentions, it seems like, at the end, where he's like, I don't know, could be like this, could be like some other ways of doing things, you know?
Yeah, he apparently admits at the end, all of this about like the original affluent society in our hunter-gatherer past is based on the presumption that our ancestors in the past lived like the Kalahari foragers and the people who he was studying in the 20th century.
Right.
You know, and he points out that like maybe that's true that they did, or maybe they didn't, and you know, so maybe we'll find out more or something. That's kind of where he left it.
Right. And so what the Davids are pointing out in connection to that is actually we know of a wide array of ways that foragers can live, and not all of them value leisure. Some of them value hard work. Some of them value hoarding goods and resources.
Yeah.
Some of them have slaves.
Yeah.
That there's actually a really wide diversity of ways that forager cultures can live and do live. And that taking the maybe most appealing version from one point of view
Mm-hmm.
Which, I mean, to be fair, I think that they agree that it's still important work to point out that life hasn't just gotten better and more carefree over time with industry.
Yeah,
You know.
yeah, definitely.
They still think that's an important contribution of Salin's.
Yeah.
But at the same time, one of the overall effects of this essay was for people to take what was not actually the most typical way of life for foraging cultures
Mm-hmm.
and extrapolate that to all foraging cultures.
Yeah, and there's definitely an argument about whether this was the most typical way of life
Right.
or not. I mean, I think as we talk about this, we'll have to complete their presentation with anthropology that's drawn from what's not in the book.
Right.
Too, in order to get a better sense of what they're getting at here. But they will basically be spending like most of the rest of the chapter
Mm-hmm.
talking about cultures who were not agricultural in the strict sense of like clearing fields and planting them. So they were foragers,
Mm-hmm.
aka hunter-gatherers, who had things like lots of material goods,
Mm-hmm.
who had things like surpluses,
Mm-hmm.
you know, because the theme of this chapter is like material
Right.
goods and surplus and
Right.
economy and work, you know, so people who maybe worked a lot, who valued work, who valued stuff, who accumulated stuff,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and also people who had things like hierarchy and stuff like that in at least one of the examples.
Mm-hmm.
And then also like people who weren't afraid of hard work, at least to accomplish a thing.
Right.
You know, like Göbekli Tepe would be an example of this. Like
Mhm.
people who, they weren't just like, no, I just want to laze around in the shade, buddy, or whatever. Like they were like, no, let's build this freaking stone temple,
Mhm.
right? So stuff that required a lot of labor, right?
Right.
So it's like pushing back against this idea that foragers, just by virtue of being in the category of a forager,
Mhm.
are people who avoid work
Mhm.
and avoid stuff, right?
Right.
Yeah, is what they're pushing back against.
Right.
Yeah. And they have some really great and really fascinating examples of this kind of thing in the book.
Yes. Forager cultures behaving in ways that would not be predicted by this Salin's essay. One of them is a place called Poverty Point that is in northeast Louisiana. I've never been there. We've had friends that have gone there.
Yeah, we've heard about it from some friends, but yeah, especially after reading about it in this book, now I want to go even more
Yeah, for sure.
and see. Yeah.
So it's basically a mound complex,
Uh-huh.
kind of, that dates to 1600 BCE.
Yeah.
Very large mounds.
Mhm.
And it's funny because we were talking about Kolomaki last time,
Right.
which has some similarities. It sounds like when they describe it, I'm kind of like, it seems like a bigger version of that. Like there's big mounds. There
Mhm.
seems to be some directionality to how they're laid out.
Yeah. And it's about 2,000 years before Kolomaki.
Right.
You know, so yeah, we're jumping back quite a
Right.
ways. Yeah.
And there are some open areas, like open lawns between the mounds as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really big site.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really big site. The authors here point out that the site is bigger than a lot of the famous early cities from Eurasia.
Mm-hmm.
It's on a bayou,
Mm-hmm.
what's called a bayou in Louisiana. And so it's on water, but it's not on like the Mississippi River or something, not a huge waterway, but it's on a bayou. And there is I think a lot of it is overgrown now,
Mhm.
but you can kind of see from artist renderings and stuff like what it would have looked like when it was active. But the most prominent feature of Poverty Point when seen from the air is like a big kind of ceremonial grounds. I mean, that's assuming something to say ceremonial, but there's like a big kind of cleared lawn area that's surrounded by these gigantic concentric ridges
Mm-hmm.
that cover a huge area. The ridges are so long and so large in themselves. Like the
Mhm.
ridges are big enough that, you know, houses could have been built on them.
Right.
And some people think that maybe houses were built on them, although I think that's a minority opinion. And the scale of this is so large that you wouldn't even maybe discern the concentric ridges very easily unless you were looking from the air.
Yeah.
You know, but there's all these concentric ridges, and then there are also like a handful of high mounds.
Right.
And one of them has kind of a central location. It's not like in the middle of the concentric rings, but it's at the edge, like kind of in the middle. You can see how it's part of the same plan, part of the same formation. The biggest mound stands over this whole kind of field area, and then there's a couple other mounds. There's a lot that could be said, and there's a lot of speculation about Poverty Point and how it was built and how it was used and everything. But one thing that I think just stands out is that the large mound, the largest mound, was built, like they can actually tell this from, doing geological cores and testing. Stuff like that it's, I can't remember the height of the mound. I should look in the book, but it's a really tall mound, and it was built in no more than 90 days.
Wow.
And they didn't even take breaks for bad weather, like rain, during the construction of the mound.
Right.
And it's been estimated that a mound that size, constructed as fast as it was constructed, would have taken a labor force of like 2,000 people to construct in that amount of time.
That's so wild. Yeah, this site is so fascinating. Some of the cool details they talk about is that there's evidence that people came from hundreds of miles around in all directions to go there. And then also there's all of these different color stone arrows.
Right.
There's like blue and red and yellow. There obviously was like a collection and sharing of these kinds of items. And there seems to be no evidence of trade. Similar sites in Central Europe have lots of trade evidence. I'm not sure what that is, honestly, but if, I'm assuming if these guys are calling it trade evidence, it really is trade evidence because they're critical of what is called trade evidence. But
right, yeah.
But at Poverty Point, there is no evidence of that. So that's very exciting, One thing I will point out here is that because we can't exactly know what's going on at the site, and it does seem to have a ceremonial purpose, this is a site of a lot of speculation from a lot of different corners. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I just want to say that at the time that they wrote this book, probably very few people have heard of Poverty Point, but I don't think that is the case any longer because of the Graham Hancock series on Netflix.
Right.
Because on one of the episodes of Ancient Apocalypse, he goes to Poverty Point. He has a whole theory around this. I could spend way too long talking about my issues with Graham Hancock, but who does a really good job of that is David Wengrow. And so...
Right. We read like kind of a really short article where he gives like a pretty concise kind of a takedown of the project that Graham Hancock is doing in general and his theory, like the theory that he's worked on for 20 years or something, basically. Yeah. So if you don't know about Graham Hancock and what his theories are, you don't really need to know.
No, you don't.
But there is this Netflix series.
It's very popular.
We watched a couple of the episodes, and one of the cool things about it actually is that they use, technology and 3D like rendering and stuff to give you a visual sense of what a lot of the sites that he visits are like, and he goes to Göbekli Tepe as well or whatever. So yeah, I'm not trying to recommend the series.
No, it's terrible.
But I'm trying to think of, there was one thing that I did like about it. Yeah, it turns out that the Davids are not the only people who are trying to seize on these like very interesting and kind of anomalous archaeological findings.
Right. Well, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you that Graham Hancock thinks it's evidence of an advanced civilization who seeded their ideas through all these different sites.
Totally typical.
Yes.
Totally typical kind of alt history type of narrative. Sure. There was like an Atlantis type of, he thinks that like there was an advanced civilization that maybe was Atlantis that went underwater or something, and that these people brought their advanced technology to every interesting place.
Yeah, that there is.
that there is that you could find.
Because none of these people could have been that interesting on their own.
Yeah, right. They had to learn it from some travelers who were fleeing, a catastrophic event or something. So,
and you won't be surprised to know that this kind of theory is in a lineage of white supremacist speculation on prehistory. So,
right.
Again, we'll just link to the Wengrow article. He's doing a much better job than we will. But I did want to say, I think a lot of people actually know where Poverty Point is now and have heard of it.
Yeah, and even I think even outside of Graham Hancock, Poverty Point is getting better known. The window in which we were able to talk about all of these archaeological sites and stuff as being like unknown or whatever is actually starting to close.
Right.
You know,
That
a
makes
lot
sense.
of people know about Göbekli Tepe now. A lot of people know about Poverty Point. And it's also, you know, but it's partially thanks to books like The Dawn of Everything and everything too. Yeah. Yeah. So Poverty Point, you know, just to get back to what is so interesting about it and why they single it out is that we're talking about a time period here where even given all of the archaeological work that has been done on the North American continent, which is a pretty well explored continent archaeologically, this is a time period in which not much is known about the diversity and the nature of the human cultures that existed on Turtle Island. And now here we have a site that's like a mega site that was constructed and used by people who were the ancestors of the indigenous nations of Turtle Island that we know of today. But before those indigenous nations, you know, took shape and took the forms that they have now. These were not agricultural people, but they were engaged in a massive collaborational project where, soapstone was brought to the site from the southeast, probably by putting it on boats or rafts and taking it down to the Gulf of Mexico, paddling it over, and then up the Mississippi and up waterways to where this place was.
Wow.
Yeah, like Janet was saying about the kinds of rocks, like one of the cool things about when rock is an artifact is that geologists can sometimes tell you where that rock came from.
Right.
And the rocks are coming from a wide area. I mean, this place drew from a huge geographic area, and at least as far as the artifacts that ended up there, but probably the people that came there as well.
Yeah, one thing that they point out is that it's a Stone Age site without stone there because it's actually a place that doesn't have much in the way of rocks.
Right.
And so all the stones that are brought in actually came from other places. You know?
Yeah, that's right, because it's like an alluvial environment or something. Yeah, so all the stone that's found there has a history like this.
So cool.
Has like a travel history. Yeah.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to point out here, because it came up in the last chapter, but we didn't really talk about it, is Stonehenge.
Yeah.
And I don't know if everyone else had the same experience, but from what I understood until very recently, generally people framed Stonehenge, the creation of Stonehenge, as a timekeeping device for an agricultural people.
Right. Yeah, because Stonehenge is in the Neolithic.
Yes.
It's in the agricultural period, and there was agriculture already being practiced in the British Isles at that time. Stonehenge is about 3000 BC-ish, if I remember right. Yeah.
But what the Davids point out here is that the people who created Stonehenge sometimes moving huge slabs great distances.
Right. Yeah, huge differences.
Yeah, I didn't understand that either until recently. But the people who created that monumental architecture had actually given up agriculture like 500 years before they built this and had gone back into subsistence life with hazelnuts as a primary dietary component.
Right.
And were living more, had returned to forager culture.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and maybe just to question that framing of going back.
Right.
It's not clear that they were living off of hazelnuts before they did agriculture.
Right, that's true.
So they might not have gone back to hazelnuts. They might have gone forward to hazelnuts.
Right.
From whatever they were doing, because they were agricultural. Right. And then for whatever reason, they had like abandoned their crops and turned into a nomadic. They still did some pastoralism, I think.
Oh yeah, they did have
but
animals.
They didn't do any agriculture.
Right,
yeah,
they still had animals.
That's right. And they were, hazelnuts were thriving in Northern Europe at this time period, and the activities of people actually facilitated the spread of the hazelnuts.
I'm sure, yeah. They coppiced them heavily. That was one of their main fuel sources, from what I understand. I read this book by D.G. Haskell called Songs of the Trees.
Right.
And there's a chapter on hazelnut in there, and he's holding and talking about a piece of charcoal from the Neolithic era that is made from hazelnut wood.
Right.
And there's still, in certain areas, you can find giant deposits of this charcoal, which is just amazing.
Yeah, that is amazing. Yeah, you can really nerd out on hazelnuts.
Yeah, some people do.
I've talked to some people who just like have so much information about hazelnuts and hazelnut ethnobotany that it's just mind-boggling. Mm-hmm. Yeah, apparently like hazelnut shells, the shell that's left after you crack the nut and eat the nut from inside of it, the hazelnut shells burn hotter than coal.
What?
They actually have like BTUs more condensed than coal. Like you could be a blacksmith just off of hazelnut shells.
Yeah. Well, you can see why people might give up some other foodways when that's around.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, right. They're super nutritious. Mm-hmm. They're like soybeans with twice the fat.
Right. And you can make flour out of them.
That was something, yeah. And really good cookies.
Without cultivating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these Stonehenge people were onto something.
Yeah, so I just wanted to point that out for anyone that's not going to read the book, because we've been holding on to the wrong story about Stonehenge, you know? And
it's relevant here, not because these were like Paleolithic people or something, that they're not, but that they were foragers at the time when they constructed these monuments.
And there were foragers who had been agriculturalists.
Yeah, and so foragers can have collaborative building projects.
Right.
And have this type of like cultural, I don't know, achievement complexity. I don't really like ranking cultural complexity. This is something that, like, actually the Davids, I don't think that they do enough to deconstruct this idea of complexity, because, like, I don't know, do nomadic hunter-gatherers like the Hadza like really have a less complex culture? Like we see things like monuments or evidence of extensive like rituals, and we call that complexity. And I'm just not sure if that's the right word for that.
Right.
But I am sure that I'm not the first person to think that thought or to ask that question. I just like felt like I should say it now.
Well, if you question complexity too much, then you don't get to make grand statements where you make fun of other people by saying, so for 10,000 years, apparently nothing happened. Right. But yeah, I think that is a worthy point. And it's interesting to try to go through the book and not use those terms and ways and frameworks when you're engaging with people who kind of are.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
One of the reasons they want to point out these examples of large-scale collaborative labor, and also just draw attention to the various foraging cultures that just had an ethic of hard work in general, is to poke holes in the ideas of people who are, I guess I would say pre-state, not working very hard, or at least pre-agricultural.
Right.
Because that very idea was used as justification for the theft, conquest, and decimation of indigenous lands around the world during the early era of colonization, and still is in places that are continuing to be colonized.
Right.
In the continuing process of colonization.
Yeah.
You know, and for those who aren't familiar with that, there was this idea that was called the agricultural argument. And it's interesting because people theorizing that working the land is what gave one right to the land.
That is the argument.
That's the argument.
That's the argument, is that the land is only like yours if you improve the land. Right. That's the way that it was talked about, to like clear the land and plant it up with crops and stuff, is to improve it.
Right.
Yeah.
And maybe without always acknowledging it, these people were responding to the indigenous critique, right? Because one of the things they're saying is your life is not better than us because you're actually not improving your environs. In a way.
Yeah.
Even though it's a little bit tricky and sleight of hand for them to do it that way.
Right.
They are saying that, and it's, you know, there's obviously some Protestant work ethic value in here, where it's like only through hard toil and transformation of the land.
Yeah.
Into something productive, which can only be productive if it looks like European agriculture.
Right.
Is to work the land or have any right to the land.
Yeah, right.
And so this was the theory, or one of the arguments that was used to justify so many aspects of colonization.
Right. I think it's kind of interesting that they bring this in here, because it makes me wonder. They're like, you know, this idea about, you know, kind of free-loving hunter-gatherers hardly working spending a lot of time like making music and just flirting and going on travels and stuff might sound good to like the hippies out there. But that very concept, that something like that is what these people's lives were like, was used to dispossess these people. Mm-hmm. And so they're like, so maybe it would be a good thing to point out that they weren't always so anti-work and were capable of all of this like hard work. But isn't what they're doing is they're like taking the agricultural argument on its own terms?
Right.
Though?
Yeah, I would say so.
You know, instead of being like, well, so what if these people were low work? They should still have not been displaced.
Right.
Instead, they're like wanting to show that they shouldn't actually have been seen as low work.
Right. I do think that part's confusing, and you know, that when they bring up Candy Aronk and other indigenous critics who said that themselves, that we work less than you guys.
Right.
They say like they were exaggerating their lives and they didn't realize how they were playing into the colonizers.
Right.
Rhetoric, you know. Mm-hmm. But I think they also know that generally people work less in a lot of these cultures. Yeah. And they agreed to that earlier in the chapter.
Yeah. But what they do point out is an important point for certain indigenous people have made is that like when y'all colonizers came, you saw where we lived and you thought that that was all just wild stuff.
Right.
And you didn't know how much we actually were interacting with that like landscape and modifying it, you know, to be more productive for us, like living in it and for the animals that we hunted and did all of these things that were not just like hands off walking through the woods and picking berries. Too, and that has been an important argument for indigenous people to make.
Yes, for sure. And I think that I first saw people talking about this more extensively in terms of California and the West Coast, because there's this book that was pretty influential called Tending the Wild.
Yeah.
That was about the land management practices of indigenous folks in the West and how much they use fire and how much they use selective planting and or preferential treatment for certain plants, preferring some over others, weeding some out, even though you weren't like officially cultivating, you know. But now we're starting to see more and more evidence of land management practices in the East as well. Those were less widely visible at the time of contact and what was recorded, and there's a lot of reasons for that, which we don't need to go into here. But fire was also a land management practice here, as you were saying, you know, to clear out space so it'd be easier to hunt, but also because fire can be very generative in certain ecosystems and plant communities.
And rejuvenative.
And so humans, the indigenous folks of Turtle Island, were actively managing a good bit of the landscape that they inhabited. Some of them moved around, some of them were more sedentary, some of them had a combination of those lifestyles.
And favored plants were planted, trees were favored, and forests and woodlands of productive nut and fruit-bearing trees were established.
Right.
You know, and none of this looks like agriculture in the European sense, where it's like you make a rectangular space and you clear everything out of it and then you plant shit out in rows, you know, like that. Although there is a very widespread worldwide sort of meta form of cultivation called swidden or slash and burn, where it can be performed in a lot of different ways. But in many contexts, like for instance in Amazonia, there would be parts of the forest that would be slashed, and then the slash would be burned, and that would clear the ground, and then the ash would fertilize the ground, and then propagules like seeds and cuttings and stuff of favored plants for food and fuel and medicine and fiber would be planted into that space, not in rows, but and most of these were perennials. So it would grow up into a multi-storied, like basically a food forest, but not just food, medicine, fuel, fiber, a forest of useful plants, you know, that was invisible to European eyes as anything that was intentionally made, right? And still provided habitat for the forest species, the birds, the bugs, the animals, and the small mammals, and all of those things as well. So not the European agriculture model, and incredibly sustainable, you know, and still like very, I don't want to say manipulative, but I mean, but like a really disruptive, intentional force in the environment. And by disruption, I just mean, if you clear a spot and then you burn everything out of it, then that is like a serious temporary disturbance, right? And what would typically happen is that plot would grow up, and once everything was big and it was all full, the plot would actually become less productive for human use, and they would move on to like maybe an adjacent part of the forest and do it there.
Right.
And so this like shifting cultivation is maybe like another one of the words for this practice is, I mean, I don't know if you want to call it a form of agriculture, but it's a form of cultivation. It's like some people would call it horticulture, and is just another illustration of the diversity of ways that people can act in their environment that, is not European style agriculture. I'm calling it European style, but I just mean what would have been like legible to the Europeans.
Conventional.
And it's also not just a completely hands-off, tiptoeing through the woods and just picking the berries that are already there, or whatever type of cartoon image either.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And I think it is important for them to point that out, even if it does seem like they're sometimes giving too much space for the agricultural critique as they criticize it. But yeah, I definitely think this part is definitely worth spending some time with, and it ties into a lot of our interests. I've been thinking about this part and about there are issues with frameworks that classify people by modes of subsistence and what they see as a sort of reductionist emphasis on work or food acquisition. And I just want to say here briefly that I think that if you just reduce that whole concept of subsistence or means of producing food to a box to be checked out of like a multiple choice situation or something, and don't think about the larger web of relations that it's part of, then it's actually reinforcing a reductive way of thinking about things, and it amplifies, or to me, it also reinforces this issue that there is in this text where they're keep separating the people from their environment.
Yeah.
And something that, we have a land project. We have done a lot of gardening. We do wild tending in the woods. We do a lot here. Some of it looks more like conventional agriculture within the garden. Some of it doesn't.
Yeah, we cut down trees, we plant other trees where, there's a lot of interaction, and some of it involves like chainsaw and all that stuff,
Right. And there's a few ways that I think about that, but I think when we first moved here, I really hated to cut down the trees. It made me feel terrible. Making clearings felt terrible. And as we've lived here over time, what we've seen is that these openings that we've made, where we've actually diversified and brought in other species and made more edges for the forest, because we live within a forest, and so we have little clearings we've made here, that actually those edges are what are teeming with life. The number of bird species has gone up exponentially here. Plants that hadn't shown up in a long time, we prefer a little more sunlight, have shown up that were in the seed bank in the forest floor.
Yeah, the amphibians
have definitely arrived en masse.
Yeah.
So we've seen this richness of life that I had to unlearn that humans can only be destructive to start to understand that.
Right. Right.
And learn that it actually, there's a way that we can be part of tending the web of life and be if I want to say more like, not so much like a spider web, but more like a weaving, like a tapestry, that we can affect the warp and weft of that and be part of it.
Right.
We don't have to only be destructive. And actually, sometimes through more active disruption and disturbance, we create more fertility and more life.
Right.
Or I guess the conditions for an outburst of life.
I might go as far as to argue that is what humans are for.
Right. Yeah.
We
can see how we have taken our skills for changing our material environs and adaptation and environmental impact in a lot of terrible directions under the conditions of capitalism. But that's us getting off course.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Another thing I wanted to say about this point that they make in here, I'm just looking down at the page, and they mention controlled burning, weeding, coppicing, terracing, building clam gardens in intertidal zones to enhance the reproduction of shellfish, and so on and so on, is that I think the Davids bring this up just to kind of move on quickly from it to make some of their larger points. But I think that bringing a more extensive material analysis to what they're pointing out here could yield some pretty interesting political thought and political implications, which is, of course, what the whole book is about. What are the political implications? Because I think that, it's true that this sort of middle way or third way, it's not really in the middle of anything, but this way that it's not the stereotyped, oversimplified idea of nomadic game hunting. And it's also not like full-on agriculture. And it's definitely not like grain agriculture. The political implications of agriculture are, sure, they're debatable, but there is some work that's been done on that.
Right.
And the political implications of nomadic foraging and game hunting, there's been some work that has been done on that. But it strikes me that for this type of life, to participate in creating an environment in which humans could enjoy hyper-productive foraging, like really intensified foraging, intensified because they've like increased the amount of abundance available partially to the humans, to access by like encouraging, the proliferation of like nut-bearing trees instead of trees that don't produce food for humans or whatever. And this type of thing can be a way to sustain the kinds of cultures that the Davids are really interested in studying, like maybe more sedentary, that have more of the cultural features that we come to associate with advanced agricultural societies, like massive ritual and big collaborative projects and earthworks and stuff like that. But at the same time, without inviting in so many of the pitfalls that come with agriculture as well, because these people are kind of living as foragers in their environment still, but they're just modifying their environment to be a better resource base for foraging. And this isn't the kind of situation where maybe you're going to have to recruit a defensive force to defend your granary and your storage of food, or your storage of, it's not like you wouldn't be storing anything, but an environment where there's a diversity of food sources that you have encouraged the proliferation of through your own efforts is one that, like some nomads could come in and, if it's the right time of year, they could run off with your whole apple harvest or something. But you're not just living off of apples. There's all these other things that you've planted, and you've got the game, and you have all this other stuff too. So anyway, I mean, we could spend more time on this, but we don't have all day. But I really think that there's a pathway for freedom, for a kind of freedom that can be carved out through this, where yes, there's work put in. Yes, there are elements of cultivation, but what's being grown and facilitated is something richly diverse, where all your eggs aren't in one basket, to use that expression, and that maybe like avoids the trap, the familiar traps of like having standing armies, defensive forces, maybe even strict territoriality,
Yeah, actually, you're bringing me back to, I got sidetracked talking about making clearings and stuff earlier, but part of what I wanted to say was that kind of relationship, that intensive foraging that you're describing so well, or garden/foraging, is something that is really transformational to the people who are participating in it as well. And that's back to what I was trying to say about the reduction of subsistence to being just like a box to be checked or something, or like a blank, like just a boring category. Like if you actually think about the way that gardening, foraging, working with plants actually changes your life, it says a lot more about you than just what you're doing to get food.
That's beautiful.
The way that we live here, like people often will be like, so what all have you done with the place? And I'm like, I would rather talk to you about what the place has done to me. Which is that learning to pay attention to the rhythms of the seasons of life here, paying attention to the migrations of the animals, paying attention to who wants to be in the garden and who doesn't, paying attention to the herbs, and the medicines and what animals work with them, all of that, that's all part of what it is to have a life that is revolving somewhat around meeting your needs from the garden and from the surrounding area.
Yeah.
And it's not just, and likewise, if most of what I was living off of was potatoes, say, because that's what I was allowed to grow.
Right.
Then my life would also have a lot of determining factors based on that reality.
Yeah.
For example, say there was a blight.
Right.
Or something, So I think that the continuing derision given to thinking about subsistence and how it affects people's lifeways is confusing if you actually look at what it means to organize your life.
Yeah.
In relationship with the land.
Yeah.
And it reinforces the problem with the book where they're kind of disconnected from the land.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Maybe we should have a better word than subsistence.
Yeah, that's probably true.
I mean, that
sure.
doesn't, it's not that it's not that the whole problem that you're describing is like located in just the nature of the word.
We could say nourishment, where do you get your nourishment? And that would actually speak more to what all I'm fed by in this life, besides calories.
Yeah, true.
I'm fed by the relationships I'm in. And it's interesting that when you look at various cultures around the world, the ones that are more in relationship,
right,
and don't have the extractive kind of connection, tend to be more nourished from their environs. And when I say that, I should also point out that you can be a forager and be completely extractive. In fact,
right.
As foraging has become really popular on social media, there are a lot of examples of extremely extractive foraging. And, we've even had guests back in the old days when there was more of a primitivist thread going through some adjacent communities where folks would come out and just one person dug up a bunch of Solomon seal roots and ate them like cucumbers, made like a cucumber salad. It was like horrifying. I'm like looking at plants that are probably 10 years old. Each one died from that. Yeah. And they didn't even leave part of it to grow back. That's extractive foraging. It's not like you can just forage and be like free and clear from having an extractive relationship with the wild. And in fact, I think the intensified foraging is a more sustainable way for us to move forward, which is what you're even pointing out here, is what are the political and environmental implications of this life.
For sure. Yeah. Our great old friend and comrade, Joe Hollis, actually, who is the steward of a small piece of land in the mountains near us that he calls Mountain Gardens. And he has a theory called paradise gardening.
Oh, yeah.
Which is kind of based around this very idea in a certain way. He got hip to the anthropology that was coming out of the 60s and a lot of the other kinds of excitement that were forming at that time, and decided to build his whole rest of his life around creating a garden for intensified foraging. He actually uses those words. He wanted to see if it was possible to grow a garden that in this case was on a pretty small amount of land that could provide a small number of people with what they needed by the way of food, fuel, fiber, entertainment, spiritual connection, all of these things all at once. And it's beautiful, and it's still going strong.
Yeah, you should visit.
I also think about this.
Also, before you move on, I just want to say, we will link to Joe's website, Mountain Gardens website, and to his YouTube channel in the show notes, because he's made a lot of videos of him talking about different plants in the garden and of paradise gardening. And I don't know, it would be cool if you actually got to see him speak. Yeah, totally.
I think he has a video about paradise gardening too, actually, that we could link to. Yeah, let's do that. The last thing I wanted to touch on, this is all related, but before we leave this topic, is that one modality that I study is permaculture. And permaculture puts a lot of emphasis on these, non-monoculture. So we could say diverse, the creation of these diverse habitats that, you can apply permaculture principles to farms as well. But the way that it's practiced by a lot of people is there's an emphasis on diverse environments, on food forests, on interplanting areas with plants that work well together and create a lot of functional diversity and a diversity of yields and all of these things. And if you would ever catch me wondering, which I do sometimes, how practices like permaculture could empower us in our quest to break out of capitalism and find our freedom again, it has to do with something like what we're talking about here, too. The transformation of these landscapes that have been determined by the needs of capitalism, like basically,
right,
into something that is actually like productive and sustaining to human life, and not just human life, but
all
fungal,
yeah.
insect, bird, all these things as well. But crucially, so that it can be like a resource for abundance,
Right.
a resource for abundance, and could somehow shift us slightly back towards the kind of life that's being talked about here, where you can go outside and find a lot of what you need.
Right.
And how empowering that would be, instead of having to rely on money and capitalism for all the things that you need. So this is how this all kind of interlinks. And this all springs from them trying to notice that there's a whole huge way of being that's neither monoculture agriculture, nor is it cartoon, totally hands-off foraging.
Yeah, it helps us imagine ways that we could get out of the enforced created scarcity of the dominant culture, recreate abundance in relationship with life around us.
Yeah.
And remember what we're here for.
Yeah. Exactly. Yes. So the Davids they're not quite done giving us examples of how foragers can have more diverse lives and ways of life than some of the stereotypes have maybe led us to believe. And their last example is actually quite a spectacular one. But can I say, before we get into this, that the title of this section in the chapter, because, each of the sections in the chapter has like kind of a cheeky title. And this one is called How the Myth That Foragers Live in a State of Infantile Simplicity is Kept Alive Today. That's the title of this chapter. And I just need to get this off my chest. I am so tired of the Davids portraying nomadic, egalitarian hunter-gatherers as infantile.
Yeah, they just come out and say it now. Yeah.
They just come out and say it. I mean, they say the myth that foragers live in a state of infantile simplicity, right? And they're referring, okay, yes, they are calling back to like Rousseau and stuff like this. And Rousseau was guilty of maybe infantilizing, his kind of idealized hypothetical version of primitive humans. But in this chapter, their examples have been hunter-gatherer anthropologists who use actually existing people,
right,
like the Hadza or the Kung or the Mbuti,
as their template for foragers,
Mm-hmm.
right? And they're saying, perhaps correctly, that yes, like it is a myth that all foragers live like the Hadza or the Mbuti, but they're also saying that to live like that is to live in a state of infantile simplicity.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this subtext that has been happening from the beginning of the book, where they're going way beyond trying to show that these people should not just be our model.
Right.
They're actually disparaging them,
Right.
calling them infantile.
Well, it sucks because I think that they, it's one thing for them to take shots at their colleagues who they think are misusing this data,
Mm-hmm.
but because they want to like tie it back to Rousseau or something like that, they have to also insult the various peoples that are being studied.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
they do this repeatedly.
Yeah, it happens a lot. And I think...
And at first I was kind of like, maybe I'm just being too sensitive.
Sure.
I'm like reading this into it. But no, I think that I have enough evidence for this now.
Yeah. I mean, I'm okay with them honestly thinking that study of hunter-gatherers that sticks to certain kinds of peoples can be boring.
Uh-huh.
They seem they're just tired of it. They're more interested in other forms of life.
Mm-hmm.
Fine. Be
Right.
interested in other forms of society. But instead of just moving forward with that and being like, let's look at the other peoples that are not doing this thing that has been so widely studied, they have to
Right.
also insult the way of life.
Well, yeah, right. And there's also, especially because this chapter is about work.
Yeah.
And things like that, there's also this kind of like almost Protestant subtext where like you're not really grown up until you like know how to work and have stuff.
Right.
If you really do just choose to spend your free time playing music and traveling and flirting and like taking naps or whatever, then that's being a child and you're not really grown up if you do that.
I think it's an unfortunate side effect of the pugnacious tone and structure of the book that they inadvertently, maybe not inadvertently, I actually don't know, but to be generous, I will say inadvertently,
Yeah.
they are reinforcing some evolutionary concepts about social progress.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And so that's what also is coming through. It's not only insulting to the subjects of these studies, it's also reinforcing evolutionary thought around social forms.
Yeah. And if we want to be generous with them about this, that they don't actually intend to do that, we can at least point out that like this effect that we're talking about, that they're like reinforcing, evolutionary theory and stuff, is the side effect of their desire for like a rhetorical flourish, like basically,
Right.
Like they want to be so strong in their attack, and leave no doubt like where they stand or whatever, that they end up going too far and actually reinforcing these things that they would otherwise be against.
And importantly, undermining their project because it's so distracting.
Yeah.
It's so distracting to see a heading before we read about this pretty interesting group of people.
Yeah.
That it's like an example of people not being infantile.
Yeah, right.
Especially once we get into it, that will become more clear. But it is really just it's so distracting.
It is, yeah. And I don't know, maybe it's worth pointing out that like a lot of these more insulting and obnoxious statements are in these titles.
Right. Yeah.
That
there's some more
punctuate the chapters.
Chapter,
there definitely is more, but a lot of them are in these chapters, where they just sound super condescending in like the all caps heading for the section. And then what they actually say in the main text is like a bit more like reasonable in its tone, at least. Okay. I just needed to get that off my chest because, this has just been bothering me since the very beginning.
It's like you start with sort of like a creeping suspicion.
Yeah.
And then it becomes no longer.
Yeah, I'm like, does David Graeber actually hate egalitarian hunter-gatherers?
I don't think so.
He thinks they need to get a job?
Right. I don't think so, but I am like, I think a lot of it is about rhetorical style. It's true.
Uh-huh.
Or like, what we said earlier, like we're burning it down and we're going to do that in whatever way we need to,
Jesus Christ, man.
Anyway.
Yeah.
But let's talk about the Calusa.
Yeah, their last kind of spectacular example of a foraging society that maybe defies the norms of anthropology are a coastal culture that were contacted and basically conquered by the Spanish in Florida that are known as the Calusa. That's and it's Calusa, the Calusa.
Yeah, these people are so interesting. They're basically a kingdom. I mean, I don't know how they identify at the time.
Yeah, I mean, they have all the features of a kingdom.
They're basically a kingdom. They inhabited the territory on the Gulf Coast of Florida from Tampa Bay down to the Keys.
Yeah.
Which contains a lot of swampland and estuary areas. They primarily...
really rich Gulf Coast. Very rich, yes. Coastal habitat, yeah.
They lived on larger marine life, but also shellfish, raccoons. There was an abundance of protein source.
Yeah.
In the form of animals. But they also were somewhat warlike and had a well-appointed flotilla of war canoes that they would take and raid other settlements around them to get canned goods, to get sometimes taking captives. They would take special items, including amber. I've been talking to Dave about how much I love that amber comes up all of the time in this book as like a special item.
Amber is very special.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they supplemented their diets also by collecting processed foods that other peoples were processing and storing. So that's an interesting thing because it's not clear to me how much they stored up, but they took other people's stored foods.
Right. So they seem to have had some aggression towards their neighbors.
Yes.
They at times took slaves. They had a very hierarchical system of government where there was like a king.
Right.
At the head, or at least, he was somebody like we might call this guy a king because he actually wore a golden crown, like a diadem, and he sat on a throne, like, very much like a king.
I mean, they even had structures in place that if he or his main wife died, then a certain number of the subjects would have to be killed too.
Right. So like the sacrificial,
Yes.
I mean, it's really interesting how, and these are some features that anthropology knows well from the institution of kingship in Eurasia specifically, and then to find it emerging independently,
Possibly,
yeah. In the Americas is telling of something. I think that's super interesting.
It is so interesting.
Right? And there was a court life around this king where they talk about like part of how the upper tiers of the kingdom, what they were concerned with was the regulation of access to foraging territory, especially coastal territory, right? So some anthropologists actually have gone so far as to classify the Calusa as a state in the kind of categories of like power complexity or like the development of entrenched hierarchy.
Systems of domination.
That like the state is kind of like the most developed form. That maybe the Calusa were even a state. And what's especially important to the Davids about this example is that they were possibly a state that had no agriculture, right? So they say in the chapter, like, the Calusa seem to be an example of a people who got stuck in a very hierarchical mode of existence, but they did so without planting a single seed, So the Calusa are really interesting in their own right, but they're being used in the context of this chapter as kind of like a final spectacular coup de grace kind of example that shows that we can't make assumptions about the political structure of people just by them being a forager.
Absolutely.
Right,
because these folks are foragers and they seem to be primarily immediate return, if we want to use those categories. Maybe they store some food?
Yeah, I kind of was looking for that in here, and I believe it does not specify. Here, let me see something.
I wouldn't be surprised if they don't want to talk about that, but...
Yeah, I don't think it says in the chapter, or I don't think the chapter gives us any clues about whether it was an immediate return or a delayed return economy, but you bring up something really important, actually, which is to point out that just by knowing that people are foragers does not actually tell us enough about their material conditions to make any specific inferences about what those material conditions would imply for their political life.
Right.
And the Davids are kind of like, they set up this sort of a straw man of anthropology that does declare that you can just assume all this stuff just on the basis of people being foragers.
Right.
And they get like way up on a high horse, like right after pointing out this stuff about the Calusa, where they basically say, yeah, so maybe this whole practice in anthropology where we think that it matters so much how people go about acquiring food, and that this determines their social organization, is just wrong from the start. Because not all foragers are like the Hadza. There's people like the Kwakiutl that did art all day and like amassed a lot of material wealth. And there's the people who did Poverty Point who had a huge collective project, over tons of years and stuff. And there's people like the Calusa who had a kingdom and slaves and a king. And these were all foragers. And they even disparage the practice in anthropology where the category of hunter-gatherers or foragers is divided up into like subcategories. And they disparage this as like just this kind of like a desperate move made by people whose argument is like falling apart underneath their feet, just to like save some shred of being able to make generalizations about foragers, and they're like, oh, so the anthropologists invent all these endless categories like complex or delayed return for foragers to try and pretend that the initial assumption is not just wrong, that being a forager implies this and that and this other thing, But really, subcategorizing foragers is actually a really important thing to do, I think. And they like kick up a lot of dust in this part to distract the reader away from considering the nature of the subcategories that people use and how it might be appropriate.
Or useful, yeah.
Or useful, but it actually like helps kind of solve the problem that they are raising, because they're like, hey, it looks like there's a diversity of foragers, and so what are we going to do with that? And that's a good question. Well, part of the answer that anthropology has come up with is to look more closely at the economic conditions of the foragers that are under consideration. And the categories of like immediate return and delayed return seems to be important if there's storage.
Territory.
Or if people have to like invest labor now to get fed later, then that seems to have a political implication. If there's territorial claims, then that seems to have an implication, And all of these things can exist within the category of forager. And in fact, the Calusa are a great example because even though, they had a kingdom very similar to the type of thing that would emerge out of agricultural states, but they did it without planting a seed. But if we look closer, we can see that they in fact had a lot of features of agricultural states. Like, for instance, they were mainly a settled people.
Right.
And it says it right in the book that access to prime fishing grounds and stuff was strictly regulated by the government, by the court, and ultimately the king, and perhaps they also stored food and there was a surplus, we don't really know that part.
Or they just took other people's stored food.
food.
And stored that food,
Yeah. And these are actually the important dynamics that set the stage for hierarchical arrangements. It's not whether you plant or whether you forage, it's whether there's territory, whether there's a surplus. It's like these types of things are what are really important. And you can have these things and still be a forager.
And you can have those things and not be hierarchical, but they are preconditions.
Yeah, right. Right. But what I'm trying to point out is that the Calusa are actually not so paradigm breaking and strangely anomalous to materialist anthropology as they want to make them out to be, because when you look at their material conditions, you actually see the material conditions that have come to be associated with more kinds of hierarchy. Not in a deterministic way, but just, over time, it's not surprising to see that. Right.
Well, and also, It's interesting because anthropology is a social science, right?
Yeah.
And what the people in the field are doing is looking at this really wide array of people in the past and the present, and looking at what some of them have in common, what they don't have in common, what patterns emerge within that.
Yeah.
This is not a desperate act of people who are just clinging to a crumbling paradigm. It's just like how you do social science.
Yeah, totally. Totally.
So that's weird. I mean, within all that, I think that they're taking up a worthy project, which is just to shake the public consciousness around
Right.
how many ways foragers live, and that foraging doesn't just equal egalitarian.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But I think that they are also, in their refusal to acknowledge the usefulness of those categories,
Right.
undermining their project of understanding how we get stuck. Because if there are material conditions that make you more likely to get stuck, don't we want to know that?
Yeah, right. We keep coming back to this question.
I mean, if there's certain categories and categories of people that have been studied, that lead you to see certain patterns of life and organization can be more likely to become systems of domination, lend themselves well to domination patterns,
right?
Then let's name those and think about them, because if there's a good chance that we are going to have some storage. We might have to have some territory,
right?
You know, like what robust structures, like you mentioned earlier, do we need to have in place to make sure that hierarchy doesn't emerge with those conditions, since that's probably what most of us are going to be needing to have.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, exactly. Even though those conditions don't make it inevitable, if you can admit that they make it likely, then you can be more prepared to go into those conditions in a smarter way. You know, but if you reject the idea that they predispose, you know, to hierarchy or whatever at all, then now you are unarmed.
Right.
Basically.
Right.
You know, and so I think that this is a flaw.
Yeah.
I think this is a flaw. One really important and good question that I think this example of the Calusa does raise, though, is the question of whether these hunter-gatherers that lived a more settled life in these rich coastal habitats, like the Calusa, or like the Kwakiutl from the Pacific Northwest, were they actually atypical of the way people have lived going back in history?
Right.
Because the Davids are right to point out that the image of, especially like the Paleolithic hunter-gatherer, are nomadic big game hunters, like the image that gets passed around and is even, you know, current inside anthropology,
right?
Not just, you know, on TV or whatever, is nomadic game hunters who, you know, you picture people on the Serengeti, or, I mean, you know, like people in the interiors, and you're not necessarily picturing people on the coasts, like netting fish out of estuaries or getting shellfish from the clam beds and stuff like that as much. And was it really atypical for people to adopt that kind of way of life in the long history of people? And if it only emerged kind of later, like if our far ancestors 200,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago were not doing that so much, why not? And if it only emerged later, then why did it only emerge later? Because these habitats are so rich.
Right.
Right? And then so it makes sense that people would gravitate towards them.
You would think so. Yeah.
You would think so. So I think this is actually a very good question, regardless of the, you know, like trying to parse out the political implications of that way of life. You know, do we need to incorporate this way of living into our, you know, far prehistoric picture of how people have lived?
Yeah, and when they briefly talk about a settlement of Turtle Island and how there's growing evidence that the Bering Strait land bridge hypothesis is actually, like, a group of people may have come over then, but there were already people here, which is what indigenous folks to Turtle Island have been saying the whole time.
Right.
You know? But part of the evidence that is mounting for that is actually around this coastal movement of people working the coasts.
Yeah.
And moving down them and working around them and harvesting all of that bounty.
Yeah.
You know, and there's evidence that goes back much earlier than the Bering Strait hypothesis.
Right.
So I think that's interesting because, as they mentioned, a lot of these sites are flooded. What might be possible for us to see where these peoples may have lived and settled sometimes in the prehistoric period, which is a huge period.
Yeah. Well, so let's pause there real quick. So if you have not read the book, what they're talking about here is really important piece of evidence, but it's really about the absence of evidence.
Right.
Because it points out that sea levels have risen pretty recently, like in the Holocene and at the end of the Ice Age, sea levels rose a lot. And so evidence of coastal people in the Paleolithic or even in the early Holocene has been submerged potentially by rising sea levels. And so this could be one explanation for why anthropology
and
archaeology underrepresents this way of life in like the big picture of humanity, is because the archaeological sites are not accessible.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate, but maybe there will be some ways to actually access more of those sites over time. But one would imagine, as you're kind of pointing to, that there's ample reason for people to settle on coast and estuary places because they are so resource rich, and one can have a rich diet without a lot of work, you know?
Right. And it raises a lot of questions, too, to think through that, where you're like, okay, let's just say that people did settle on coasts a lot, or that they did subsist off of coastal resources. Number one, does that imply settlement?
Right.
Could you be a nomadic coastal forager? Possibly.
Yeah.
Could you be an immediate return coastal forager? Probably not in the Arctic, but maybe in the tropics or something, or in Florida. Maybe you could be an immediate return. That would have some political implications.
Right.
But also, part of what is confining and part of how people lose freedom through settlement is that it becomes harder to walk away from the social arrangement.
Right.
But in, maybe a Paleolithic era of lower population densities, when there was like lots of good foraging habitat, even not on the coast and stuff like that, maybe the political implications were less dire, because even if your people were working a coastal estuary or something, that if you didn't like what was happening there, then you could walk away more easily. And so even just the freedom to walk away makes it harder for people to dominate. So there's a lot of open questions about what the political implications would have been for coastal foragers, in, say, the Paleolithic, right? And I'm bringing this up because we do see, not a 100% match correlation pattern, but we do see a pattern where some of the coastal foragers that are known to history have been more hierarchical formations. Like the Kwakiutl, quite hierarchical, had slaves. The Calusa, quite hierarchical, had slaves. But we needn't assume that coastal foragers 20,000 years ago, that we're hypothesizing probably existed somewhere, had that kind of politics necessarily.
Yeah, that's true. Also, you're pointing to something that I just want to clarify for the listeners, which is that we're moving through prehistory into the Holocene and into the present, even. Yeah. You do see more patterns of settlement. And as we say, we don't know how many there might have been in these coastal areas, but generally within what's called the Neolithic area, when agriculture began to appear in more places, there was an increase in settlement and sedentary populations. Yeah. And urbanization in some cases as well.
Eventually.
And so it's important for us to also think about what might have led to that pattern. Yeah. And for one thing, we know that there was a proliferation of human population. Yeah. There were more and more people. Yeah. And as population density reaches a certain point, then the ability to just move around indefinitely might become less feasible.
More constricted, yeah.
Yeah. And there are likely other incentives that would lead people to start to settle. And we don't know what all of those are, but what we do know is that there emerged more of a pattern of settlement during that time period.
Yeah. I actually covered this a little bit in episode 3 when I gave the rough sketch of kind of like the overall big historical trends of human history. and some of the proposed material explanations for those trends, that standard anthropological narrative is actually not really contradicted by these findings that they're talking about in the book, because what we do see is more transition to more settled intensification, utilizing aquatic resources, intensifying relationships with plant species, like nut-bearing trees, hazelnuts or oaks or something like that, as the Pleistocene transitions into the Holocene and in the end part of the Paleolithic, right? And I'm not going to go over all that again, but it has to do with climatic fluctuations and population of people leaving Africa, going into more polar types of environments and stuff. So this emergence of a higher likelihood of people adopting these more settled life ways is not only noticed, but is kind of in the model as well, that there were certain pressures, and not just pressures, but opportunities moving into the Holocene for people to live in this way, you know, and the Holocene became a more stable, kind of more abundant environment just in general, because it was warmer and wetter and a more stable climate, and so this opened up some pathways for people. So we would expect, you know, to see stuff like this.
Okay, so the last part of the chapter is them laying the foundation for a new conception of the emergence of property, or the idea of property, in prehistory, and they just sort of sketch this out, and they're going to come back to it later in the book, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on it. But
and it's only a couple pages in the book, really.
They are presenting a case that what would become property, honestly private and communal in some ways, began with different approaches to ritual objects. So began with what was considered sacred.
Right.
You know, because what is sacred is what's set apart. And there's special rules about who can touch it, who has access to it. And this might be an object. It might be land. You know, it might be a special item that may be manufactured or not, you know?
Yeah, they actually, partially to argue that these embryonic kind of property relations that come out of ritual and sacred spaces may go way, way back in human history. They talk about immediate return hunter-gatherer ethnography conducted by James Woodburn. You know, so they bring Woodburn back and talk about how, you know, these immediate return people who had no surplus, shared everything. Also, in a lot of cases, the one kind of thing that was not shared, that was actually kept secret, kind of protected, you know, and was treated in a way that we might kind of squint and say that it was like something like what property would become, were like ritual objects. Like they talk about these special flutes that would be hidden, or sacred bundles or things like this, that when you first see anything like property or an object that is not allowed to be touched by certain people or something like that, that it's when these objects are sacred, you know?
Yeah, which is really interesting. And a reminder, a lot of those prehistoric monumental architecture sites also seem to be connected to ritual. And so to think about monumental building, like large-scale cooperative labor, and property, as possibly beginning within sacred frameworks, is really interesting.
Yeah. This little part of the chapter is really something to pay attention to if you are interested in especially Graeber's attempt at like a novel contribution to anthropological theory, because he, not just in this book, but throughout his career, he really worked with this idea that a lot of the institutions that we associate with like our domination institutions, hierarchy, property, etc., emerged from sacred or like ritual, kind of like quasi-religious practices and spaces in people's lives. He and Marshall Solins have a whole book called On Kings, where, like, among other things, Graeber argues that even fiercely egalitarian people think of themselves as being, like, ruled by spirits in certain ways. And so there's, like, hierarchy, even if it's not in the material realm, you know? And so he's kind of implying that this kind of sets the template, you know, for what actual material hierarchy would look like between people. So Graeber works with this, you know, and here at the end of this chapter, that is about property and about material wealth. They plant the seed of this idea that maybe here is where we should be looking for the origins of what would become an aspect of later forms of domination.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that's it for this chapter.
Yeah, maybe we can just leave it at that.
For now. We'll come back to that idea later.
There's a little more ethnography in that part of the chapter, you know, and if you're interested in this, you should read it. But it will be something they come back to as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So next time, we're going to discuss Chapter 5, many seasons ago, why Canadian foragers kept slaves and their Californian neighbors didn't, or the problem with, quote, modes of production.
Oh, yeah. Gosh, we had a lot to talk about in Chapter 4, huh?
We really did.
It ended up being a lot to talk about. But
I think it's going to be a lot to talk about next time, too.
As always, some really fascinating anthropology.
Take care.
All right, we'll be back for Chapter 5.